everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We are here with Sean Ramirez to talk about global food waste and how AI may be able to offer some solutions and just paint a picture around this really important topic. And I'm really excited to have Sean here with us today. Sean, can you kind of give us a little, you have an interesting background. Your roots are in political science. I think now you kind of have your hands in a few pots doing a lot of different interesting things. Can you just give us a little bit of a background around who you are, how you got here, and and also I'd be interested to hear how you got into, food waste as a passion, I guess, is how I would put it when I hear you talk about it.
Sure. Yeah. So I was a political science professor for about a decade, which is a long time. Studied terrorism and strategic negotiations, international negotiations about war and peace. Really wanted to make a huge global impact if possible. Loved using data to understand how complex things can be, how systems work, and how to honestly make models that are very useful in society and create good predictions. Moved over into the data science space and working in industry, found myself just attached or gravitated toward AI for good projects or AI for good companies. Eventually came to work at a company called Shelf Engine that really focused on reducing global food waste by forecasting for grocery stores. And just got a lot of exposure to that topic then, and really then became a real champion for this in terms of understanding how can AI help, how does food waste connect to all kinds of additional concerns on resource conservation and climate and everything else. So I really just got very interested and passionate about it. And while I don't work for that company anymore, I still am very focused on supporting AI for good solutions, and I'm still clearly attached to this space.
Great. Yeah. And I feel like, just want to say before we move on, I feel like we could do a whole nother podcast in your political, history, because it sounds super fascinating. And I honestly, it's hard for me to even understand what that looks like. But anyway, very, very interesting. Well, can you help us first kind of understand the problem? Like what is the landscape of the problem? I mean, it seems pretty large in the summary statistics I've looked at, but I'd love to hear your perspective on what the summary of the problem really is.
Yeah. I think when we think about global food waste, it's easy to say well, it's just food. It's not a huge global problem that we really have to tackle. Like, why should it be one of the United Nations top goals for 2030, for example, right? And so to put it into perspective, if you think about population growth overall, the population is growing at such a huge rate. So I remember the time, and this may date me, I remember the time when we were only, 5 billion going on 6 billion people. And now we're talking about 8 to 9 billion, right? So, and honestly, that wasn't that long ago. So the exponential growth rate that we're seeing means that we're putting a larger tax on our resources, on our environment, on our globe as we grow, right? And that's only going to get worse. So now let's bring it down to food. We have to feed all those people. And if we think about the current food that we're growing and the current food that we're creating and the amount of hunger, so just putting that into perspective, in the United States, about 40% of food is wasted. It costs $400 billion a year right now, which is a huge amount of money. And at the same time, we have 40 million people in the United States suffering from hunger, including 12 million children. And to put that into perspective, that's 1 in every 6 children. So if you think about the number of kids in your child's classroom, if 1 out of 6 is suffering from hunger, that's a lot of people suffering from hunger, and a lot of families and adults in many different situations and life circumstances. So that's a really highly impactful situation. It turns out if we reduce food waste by 15%, which is not very much, we'd actually feed more than half of those hungry people. So if we reduce waste by a third, we would feed all of them in the United States.
Now, if we're able to, and that's if we're able to reduce it and redistribute it to them.
And redistribute it. That's right. Yep. Yeah. Definitely always thinking ahead, Tessa, that next step. In Europe, right, this is a global problem. So in Europe, we have 153 million tons of food being wasted. Again, we could cite similar statistics for Europe as well. It's not that it looks exactly the same, but there are similarities. And globally, about 1/3 of all food around the world is wasted. So we're talking about $1 trillion. And if we were to redistribute it, we would feed 2 billion people annually. And that actually would feed all, not just hunger, but all undernourished people around the world 2 times over.
Wow.
So if we could reduce and redistribute that food waste, we would have a massive global impact. We would also reduce the tax on our environment, on our food and our water. And of course, that also has this tangential impact on the climate as well. It turns out that if you were to reduce this food waste, and reduce the CO2 that's emitted from food waste. So when food decomposes, it releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And then in addition to that, all the energy also that it takes to grow that food and to make that food, transport that food to different places, that also reduces, that also impacts the CO2 in the atmosphere. If we were to add all that up, food is responsible, just food waste, not food itself, but food waste is responsible for the third largest country of CO2 emissions. So just behind China and the United States would be food. So if you think about, hey, we want our countries to, reduce their carbon footprint, we actually want food to reduce that carbon footprint even more.
That's an astonishing statistic.
Yeah, that's extraordinary.
It's wild, right? So once you start thinking about it, you start thinking, okay, if we reduce food, we can feed hungry people. That's the first layer. If we reduce food, we can reduce water use. We can improve land use, right? If we reduce food, we also hopefully bring down prices for people because we're actually paying for that food waste, right? We're paying for the increased transportation, the increased cost to ourselves. We're also paying for that in taxes as well, because there are tax subsidies or other things that are going to those food producers to make that food possible, which is contributing to that waste. And then on top of that, this has an environmental impact, whether you believe in global warming or not. This has an environmental impact in so many ways. And so, yeah, as we grow and as that population scales, because that population is growing, we're either going to make it worse or we can make it dramatically better.
Sure. So when you talk about the full end to end, like I'm thinking about from the start, right, where food is born, basically, that's a weird word to use, but sprouted. And then all the way to when it's in our kitchen, what's do we have an idea of how that waste is distributed across that whole system? Because I imagine the solutions are different wherever you're sort of in and where the waste is.
Definitely. That's definitely true. And it turns out that question of where does food waste occur? Who's responsible for the food waste? It would be nice if we could point to one group and say, hey, it's always this group. Let's build solutions for that group. It turns out that answer is different around the world. So it's going to look different in different places. So in the United States, about 60%, so more than half of the food waste occurs before it reaches consumer grocery baskets, which means that, often I'm asking people, say, well, who do you think is responsible here? Is it the farms throwing away huge amounts of food? Is it the restaurants and hotels throwing away a lot of food and grocery stores throwing away a lot of food? Or is it people in their houses and, my children throwing away a lot of food? And while I, may have mother's guilt where I think, oh, it's my children, it turns out actually it's the other end. It's before it reaches consumers in the United States. That said, 40% does come from the United States of the U.S. food waste comes from those households and those consumers. So when we're talking about, hey, could we make a dent? Could we reduce that global hunger problem if we were to redistribute our own food? The answer is yes. We would make a significant dent if individuals were to take on part of that responsibility. So that's an interesting dynamic to it. But 60% of that in the US comes from before it reaches consumer grocery baskets. Now that number actually flips in an interesting way, which Sophie may know about because she's from our European counterparts, where it's actually more the 55 to 60% actually occurs in consumer households there. And the waste, only 40% of waste is coming from these other locations. They're wasted in productions, they're wasted in stores or retailers. So that number flips as we cross the Atlantic Ocean. And then if you look at developing countries, most food loss in developing countries occur in agricultural production, meaning that it's wasted in practices, there's just inefficient practices, or there's problems transporting to markets or marketplaces, or problems in redistribution. And so a lot of that waste is actually occurring on that end of the spectrum instead. So it's really an interesting thing where depending on where you are around the world and how you want to tackle this is going to look different and really be specific to those places.
But in some ways, couldn't we also like learn from it? Like, I'm just, even thinking about the European American, it's like, as an American, I'm questioning, like, what is Europe doing differently that their waste prior to being in the home is so much less? Like, I don't understand those differences. And maybe it's not something we can leverage, but it's notable.
It is really notable. And absolutely some of the practices we have in agricultural production are being, transmitted or there's education and training and technological resources that are being transferred to developing countries. That's one large effort in order to shore up that number so that there's less food waste there. Within Europe and the United States, I think it's much more complicated, unfortunately. There are different policy factors and other factors that are impacting the root causes of that waste, which is really multifaceted. And so tackling those things or trying to put a finger on it is a challenge. And actually within Europe also, and I don't know these numbers off the top of my head, but within Europe also, there are some interesting differences. France and Italy have interesting differences that they pay attention to. France has a huge the agricultural lobby, we might say, is very strong in France. And so its cultural leanings put it in a certain way. And so it approaches food coming from farms differently than a lot of other countries do, or with more tighter restrictions and regulations. Similarly, food waste in Italy, where it's highly agriculturally centric, there's amazing basil and other kinds of fruits and vegetables grown there, as well as livestock. And they really care about that agriculture that they're producing and the wine culture that they're producing. So all of it is part of it. And so food destruction is really there's a really political ban on food destruction, which may affect those farms and producers differently. And that sort of power doesn't necessarily, that policy making doesn't actually exist necessarily in the United States.
They also have in Italy a major issue with food provenance. Their products are so world famous that the ham, the wine, the tomatoes, other locations are basically saying it's Italian olive oil, it's Italian pasta, it's Italian Parma ham, and it isn't. So they've had to bring in much tighter supply chain management, not to reduce food waste, although that's benefiting from it, but to be able to prove end-to-end provenance that the product is what you're buying. Yeah. And the second you monitor a supply chain in any way, well, inherently, you're going to improve other things as well.
Yeah, we can definitely go into the data monitoring aspect of all of this. There is a really interesting data story here when we think about how to solve for that. But maybe it might be good to talk about some of the other factors that like literally make this hard. I can say from experience at Shelf Engine, there are a lot of different things that make reducing food waste hard. So at Shelf Engine, we had a really interesting premise and an interesting business model. So the business model was very simple and direct in one sense. It was basically like, we order your apples at the grocery store, and if it sells, we make a little margin, and if it doesn't sell, we pay for it, meaning we pay for all the waste that occurs. That meant that we had to have really good data on what was getting wasted. It turns out that is a line item that is often not thought about. So if you think about what you buy at home, you of course think about your budget, probably think about your budget to ask, how much am I spending on food? What you don't think about is how much am I spending on food that I'm actually throwing away, and tallying that up. So that same calculation or missing data problem that we have in our homes, that's the same missing data problem actually that happens at stores. Stores do account for it by approximating what they call shrink, which is that shrinkage in the inventory that occurs because of waste. But it's really hard to track, right? We're not actually labeling everything. We're not tracking the food that goes in and out. So if yogurts get smashed in delivery, if apples get damaged, if bananas get damaged, those kinds of things actually disappear as line items. So it's really hard to actually uncover, hey, are we shrinking? Are we wasting 5%? Are we wasting 30%? Those things like that become very challenging, right? And if you're not predicting it, you're not tracking it, you're not really thinking about it in a way that impacts your bottom line. So you're not incentivized necessarily to make that change. that's going to enable there to be less shrink.
Well, and on that line, isn't it? I had read some stuff about standardization of labels and expiration dates, and I imagine that's kind of key in here because it's different when food is wasted because it expired in the store. I imagine like that kind of nuance is even beyond what you have seen in your work of available data, but would be a really interesting distinction.
And actually, there's a campaign here where they're removing expiration dates because, as I said, so much waste happens in the home, and people were binning good food because it was past the expiration date. We don't, and you can tell if your celery has gone off. You don't need a label on it.
Yeah, expiration dates are set. They're set in interesting ways, right? So for one, like the science behind how these expiration dates are set, like how is your milk expiration date set? What we do is we take 100 or so milks and we set them out and we see how long it takes for them to waste. And then we stamp the expiration date, which tells us actually not necessarily when it's safe to consume, but actually like when is it good to sell? So you have a window beyond your expiration date where it's still safe to consume, but it may not be the best to sell that at that time. So there's a difference there in your expiration date. Eggs actually are fairly well studied for this. So there's a good week or two beyond the expiration date, and this will vary by country. So that's why I don't want to give a specific number. But in Europe, for example, this is highly regulated. So there is actually a set number of days that you can go beyond the expiration date where your eggs are perfectly safe to eat, but the stores are no longer able to sell them. It's actually illegal for them to sell. So they need to either redistribute it or throw it out. And that means that because they can't sell it, let's just put it this way, like those are free eggs for someone if we could get it to the right people. Those are free edible eggs for the next 2 weeks. And, in terms of eggs in my household, they probably go in about 2 weeks. So that means those are free eggs that we could be eating at home. So yeah, that's the expiration date, sell by labeling issue and awareness of when food actually goes bad or when it's no longer safe to eat, and education on that actually is a large component of how we can make this better.
So then redistributing, like you're saying, redistributing after you can't sell it. This goes back to what you were saying about trying to feed hungry people, right? From what I understand in some brief conversations we had, there's actually limitations there, right? Like in terms of how people can distribute food. I don't know if it's related to this exactly, but I'm curious now.
Yeah. If you're a grocery store or you're a restaurant or you're a hotel, you are almost hyper aware of people getting sick because of your food or the risks or liabilities involved in that, right?
Yeah.
In fact, you're probably much more aware of that than you are of any protections around donating food. And so what's interesting is like there are actually something called Good Samaritan laws that are in place to encourage food donation. These were actually signed apparently into law in the United States. The Bill Emerson Good Samaritan law was signed into law in the US in 1996, which is a long time ago. So it's been around for a while. And what this does is it says, as long as you didn't have internal misconduct or intentional negligence in donating food, it is okay to donate. Now, the way that law actually works in different states in the US is different. And I should say also, Europe has similar laws as well that protect for food donation. Again, the way that works in different countries may be different, although the EU is probably standardized. But the complications arise once you start thinking that everyone actually has the same, if I cross state lines, I have similar notions, and I'm a business owner, I have similar notions of the liability and risk involved. But I don't come in with that knowledge in advance of here's how I would donate the food that's going to waste, right? So it's similar to, say, recycling laws in different places. Every time you go to a new jurisdiction, you have to learn the recycling laws about what actually gets recycled here or what doesn't. And it takes effort on your part to learn that and then adopt those practices or habits that actually puts into place the efficiencies that we want out of recycling. So this is the same thing for restaurants, hotels, and other food donations, groceries. They have to actually make the effort to go ahead and learn those things. It is not well known, and because it changes by states or changes by jurisdictions, these become really strong boundaries that prevent those habits that then allow you to say, hey, these are expired. What should I do with them?
Sure.
I need to move on and run my business. Donating food does not factor into that calculation, again, because we're not looking at the line item of how much that actually costs us when we throw those things away.
Is there not any kind of in either the EU or the United States or any other country like tax benefits for donations? Is that not a thing?
There are. So taxes work in two different ways. So, and what's interesting about businesses, right? This gets really complex with tax laws, and I am not an accountant, so I don't know all the details. But what I can tell you is that, you can, if you waste food, you can take a deduction because you have a loss against profit, right?
Oh,
so,
wow.
So there's that edge, which actually can increase waste or at least create like a moral hazard where you don't reduce the waste, because why bother? It's going to give you a 10% deduction on your taxes. At the same time, yes, it's true that if you donate that food, you can get a tax deduction as well, where you write off that tax because you're donating the food and supporting a good cause. So yeah, it works in both ways, which also makes it complicated. So there's not a clear incentive there. There are some states around and some countries around the world that like the France and Italy examples that put greater bans and create these stronger incentives for business alignment. But it's been very challenging to get businesses to actually move on their commitments. So a lot of countries or a lot of companies around the world have made these and taken on, because the UN has this sustainability goal, they've committed also to, we want to reduce food waste by 2030 as well. And so they have jumped on this bandwagon, which is awesome. There's no shortage of companies doing that, but actually making the moves and taking on those right policies internally, creating the collaboration, adopting new practices, that has been a different story. So we haven't seen that kind of adoption as widespread, nor like as many success cases.
Wow. So I think and to go back to, I think we kind of went down a little rabbit hole, which I thought was right. But what do you think are some of the other factors that make it hard, basically, that are impacting this sphere?
Oh, yeah. So it's not just policies and business incentives, definitely. There's, if you think about what makes food waste hard in your own house, like how do you control it? Definitely, I'm not trying to waste my food in my house. And we're talking about a really localized space, right? I have good knowledge of my kitchen. I know generally what my family likes to eat, and I still try not to waste food, but it's still hard, right? Why is it hard? Because Friday ends up being really sunny and you didn't predict it, but it turns out that everybody wants fresh fruit and to go out for a picnic on Friday. So you're no longer eating the thing that you bought anymore, right? And that kind of thing happens. So now let's scale that. And this is exactly the problem we had at Shelf Engine, and a problem that many people have, which is, how do you have that accurate demand forecasting for consumer demand? How do you know what people are actually going to buy? During COVID, this was extremely challenging.
Oh my gosh.
Right? You remember the run on toilet paper that I think spread around the world. There were flour shortages because everybody was baking. Right. One year for Thanksgiving, people didn't buy turkeys anymore. They all bought little chickens. So people couldn't predict this. And then the next year, what did grocery stores do? Well, they went and bought 50-50 chickens and turkeys. And guess what? A lot of those probably went to waste, right? So there was a lot of unexpected things that happened, people who didn't get together for certain holidays that are major food holidays, but grocery stores wanted to be prepared. And an interesting thing that I found out while I was working at Shelf, or that I discovered, was part of the reason for this is in a way how groceries are indexing on whether they're doing a good job. So the number one question that every grocery store in the US asks, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is true around the world, when you walk out of a grocery store, you will automatically get asked almost 100% of the time, did you find what you were looking for? And so when you're asked, did you find what you were looking for? The answer they want to hear is, yes, you found everything you were looking for. In order to have a yes answer for every single person who walks in, you need to stock that grocery store full of all the rainbow assortment of food that you expect at a beautiful grocery store, so that you can walk in and have that freshness, that color, that vibrancy that makes you hungry. So you buy everything possible. And similar to that weather situation that I mentioned, where it was sunny in my house and all of a sudden we were going out for a picnic instead of eating that wonderful like pasta casserole that I was going to make. Well, grocery stores face that same problem, right? Instead of the meat or other things that they were expecting, say the weather's going to be really sunny, on those probable sunny days that you cannot predict in the spring when it turns from rain to sun and everybody suddenly goes outside, grocery stores need to have their shelves full of all of these pre-packaged fruits and vegetables that go to waste pretty quickly. So cut pineapple, veggie trays that cost $20 instead of $3 if you cut them on your own, fresh made guacamole, all of the wonderful things that I think we love to eat at grocery stores because they're super convenient. All of that actually wastes faster. It also has an impact on plastics waste as well, because those are put in containers, right, that then get tossed too. So now we've got 3 rows of 6 containers of pineapple, cut watermelon, cut fruit, strawberries, berries, grapes, fruit trays, veggie trays, and all of that piles up and you will never look at this aisle in the same way again. But that is the over ordering that has to occur in order to keep us answering that question in the right way. So did you find what you were looking for? Yes, I did. And that is causing part of all that waste and that inability for us to predict that consumer demand. That is a natural thing that happens at grocery stores because we're expecting now to have fresh food annually. I should always be able to get strawberries, no matter what season it is. I should always be able to get kiwi fruit, or always be able to get mangoes and fresh avocados. And so now we have this added uncertainty about everything, and we're potentially wasting these massive amounts of food. Trickle that back a step. The goal at Shelf Engine was definitely to reduce waste, not just at grocery stores, but also all the way up the supply chain. So that uncertainty and that over ordering that occurs means that they're passing that over ordering on to producers. Now those producers have to supply the extra food, plus producers face their own uncertainty as well, right? So they have bad weather too that spoils crops. They have drought, they have floods. They also have supply chain issues because things don't necessarily get delivered, something gets delayed. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. Factories or food processing can damage certain goods. So you've got to factor that in and cost in an extra 5 to 10% of your product that you're going to make in order to fill those orders. All of that means that to supply that food, now we're overproducing extra food too. And then with supply chain, I want you to just sort of think about this as like, how does supply chain affect this? Of course, we know supply chain complexity now during COVID is so hard, right? It's so hard to get something on time. Everything is always late, right? So now let's add this in. There is an interesting something called a bullwhip effect with this, where the uncertainty at one end, like you're swinging a rope and you're wiggling it, it starts to wiggle at the end and land in wilder patterns because you wiggle at one end a little bit, it vibrates through and trickles through.
Wow.
So think about
That's
it
a
this
good analogy.
Yeah, think about it this way. Like imagine you are trying to get to work and you try to get to work and you wake up like 5 minutes late. Not too bad, right? Can you get to work 5 minutes late? Probably that's okay. But now you miss the first bus and then you miss your transfer and all of a sudden you're an hour late, right? So that is the kind of uncertainty and impact that we see in supply chain, where uncertainty at one end, where pickups change a little bit, they shift a little bit, and it moves to the next segment of that supply chain and it becomes a little bit more delayed, and it moves to the next segment, it becomes a little bit more delayed. That becomes greater uncertainty. And of course, for fresh food that has to arrive on time, it means we have to bake in that uncertainty and over order and overstock those paths so that it gets to the right place with the right amount on time. So supply chain complexity is very hard to manage.
Just also, you mentioned we expect the certain things all year round. I'm English, strawberries, obviously. But what we notice is when it's out of season and we still expect it, it comes from further and further afield. And from those locations where you said most of the issues are actually in the agricultural production. So not only have we got local, we've now got all of those, issues in Kenya getting our strawberries over, creating, issue with shipping. We've still barely recovered from the issues with the Panama Canal last year in terms of our food supply over here. And all of that partly because we don't want to eat food when it's in season.
Yes, that's right. Buying seasonal local foods, like when people talk about it as if like, oh, this is a solution, it is a solution. Buying seasonal local foods, buying from your farmer's market where it's locally grown, it has spent less time on the truck. Honestly, it's fresher because it wasn't transported from thousands of miles away. It didn't involve all of this stuff. Yes, there is overproduction there as well locally, of course, and they are arriving with, cases full of food that will also go to donations or other things, or be thrown into landfills. Those are all part of the solution. Still, is going to these local places and buying local foods.
Yeah.
Yep.
Wow.
So yes, eat local.
It's hitting home way harder than it ever has, if I'm honest, in this conversation. Intellectually, I've always understood that. And I'm like, oh, that makes perfect sense. And then hearing the way you're talking about it, I'm like, oh my gosh, my gut is sinking, actually. So hitting home in terms of that. Yeah. One other area that I imagine makes it hard that I was just reading up on the other day is this concept of I guess I read it in terms of concept of upcycling, but really it's to account for wasting food as you're turning it into something other than raw food, like a strawberry turning into jam, I guess is a solution for that, I think. But like, because that's a big part of it too, right? Is that we're like, oh, there's bits and pieces we actually just want to throw away that aren't.
Yes, because we were talking about how the whey from Greek yogurt gets turned into whey powder, protein powder.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So there are, and we should talk about the AI solutions, because I think that there are, like, that is the purpose of this. And so
it is.
The problem is huge. Let's focus on some solutions. So on the AI solutions, and there is a lot of like hope on the horizon, I think, in terms of this. So the way I've grouped these, and this is my own grouping, this is not like a part of the international standards for grouping of AI solutions.
I appreciate you doing the grouping for me. So.
There's like two big categories of these solutions so far. One is on more sustainable farming and agriculture, which is super interesting. There are all kinds of AI-enabled monitors, computer vision, remote sensing, robots, vertical farms. And I want to highlight some of those. And then there's another set of solutions. So to highlight some of those, to give you a flavor for what these fascinating solutions are, there is, and what the possibilities are for this. Eden Green, for example, is this amazing company that uses towers with stacked plant cups. And these stacked plant cups are equipped with AI-controlled temperature, light, humidity, plant food, water, etc., and use the recycled water as it trickles down. And so what this does, another company called 80 Acre Farms is very similar. It adds to that by adding robots to support heavy lifting, to do this at large scale, like they take over blocks essentially and make these what they call 80 acre farms. They're actually single vertical farms that produce the same amount of fruits and veggies as an 80 acre farm. They use 97% less water.
That's insane.
Wow.
And it runs on renewable energy, right? It can be located inside of old buildings, old warehouses, used shipping containers. And because they're indoors, they operate without pesticides or herbicides in controlled environments. They also grow food all year round. So you can have your strawberries in the middle of winter. You can have these different things if we provide these plants with enough food and the things they need, water and light to grow, but we can do that now. And so that's really amazing. And AI enables all of this to be monitored through these sensor technologies, regulated through these distributions that are automated. So it reduces that human labor element as well, which we can talk about labor rights in another episode. But all of that
also helps with the bullwhip analogy, right? Like
exactly. Yeah. There is a lot of movement in this around the world. So there's also a Swedish company, which if you haven't seen this, you should look it up. It's really fascinating, called Plantogon. So plant and then ogon. They are retrofitting old office buildings to turn them into huge greenhouses. They're entirely autonomously controlled, and they actually look stunningly beautiful. If it works, it means that these beautiful buildings that, can populate inner cities can actually feed 5,000 people right now, which would be amazing. So a single, city block basically could turn into a plant food source that is gorgeous and, really improves the aesthetics of your city, as well as making it a better place to live. A Singapore-based company is also doing something even cooler, I think, although we'll see how well it works. It is called Sky Greens. It's actually entirely driven by hydraulics, so that's wild. It has this really unique frame, and what it does is it has plants at the bottom that get food and water, and then as it goes to the top, they rotate so that the plants at the top get sunlight, and then they rotate back.
Wow, interesting.
And so again, these are ways that we're going from vertical farm technology that we saw maybe 3 or 4 years ago to these huge buildings that become easily locally centralized in densely populated areas or even less densely populated areas to supply that local food movement and to feed people in a really interesting, unique way that also reduces that carbon footprint, that reduces food and land water usage and things like that. So that's one class, which is super fascinating.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. That's super interesting. I didn't know the detail. I still don't really know the details of a lot of those solutions, but it's really compelling to me how ingenious they are. I mean, 97% reduction in water consumption is just astonishing to me.
And there's something very special about knowing your food was grown there. It's as well as helping that carbon footprint, it also just helps your community and everything around it, as well as shifting the norms on what you expect food to look like.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess on that note, just to linger for a second, I just wonder if, there will be another side of that camp. Like, I share your sentiment, but if there'll be another side of the camp who's like, no, I want mine from like the traditional farm, that's the resistance on the other side. I can imagine it.
Which you can have both. You can have the traditional farms nearby. I think what will become more of a luxury good is, do you get the kiwi now from Kenya, or do you get avocado from Mexico? Those kinds of things. And there are downstream implications to that for those economies as well. So definitely all kinds of things.
I mean, I would prefer if it wasn't even considered a luxury, but rather a stain. Like, you need the avocado from Mexico, but
So there's a second class, which I want to share too, because it's also related to the work that I did at Shelf Engine, but it is doing that trickle up the supply chain that is really interesting. So not on the farming side per se, but really to help improve planning and use AI to improve planning. And this is happening in different places. So Shelf Engine did this at grocery stores, where we would optimize the freshness of your food by predicting consumer demand, thinking about inventory. And there was a lot of inventory simulations and optimization to think about that, which was highly complicated for all kinds of perishable goods and non-perishable goods as well. So things like peanut butter that lasts a long time, things like blueberries that are seasonal, where production migrates across the United States, that is very complicated, as well as things like deli and meat, which are sliced in the store. And you have to think about, well, how much is going to be left in the middle of America, where I don't have a person to tell me what's going on, but I need to still predict how much ham is going to be left, so I order the right amount of ham next time. So those are all complicated things. That same kind of ability to predict use and build these sensors out is actually happening in a lot of other places as well, up the supply chain. So a company called Heliopause, for example, they use satellite data to do remote sensing on a space, meaning that they take a look at the land and water use from a remote like satellite, and they look at the history of drought risk, water use, land quality, etc. And then they pass you an irrigation plan, as well as help you see things remotely about your own suppliers. So if you are a production plant and you're collecting flour from one place, butter from another place, etc., to make bread, you can actually use Heliopause to then get the remote sensing to see, am I going to be impacted so that I'm not going to be able to make the fresh bread that I want to make in September for some sort of holiday, or for Christmas time? Am I not going to have the supply that I need? Is it going to be at risk? And so they're using this remote sensing to then pass you that information, which I think is fascinating. Again, like connecting the data across the supply chain so that you can make better informed decisions. Another company called Folio 3 is using infrared, thermal, and electromagnetic sensing. And that tells you all kinds of interesting things about how healthy your crops are by monitoring things like how much chlorophyll there is, or how fertile your soil is. So
Right.
how wild is that you can do things like that? It can do things like give you crop yield forecasting to help you understand, like, should you rotate or transplant your crops? Should you change the irrigation patterns? Should you think about unexpected weather patterns that are going to happen? And potentially to integrate that shifting demand as well. So there's this possibility that as these companies build these solutions out, perhaps they can become more jointly partnered and connected to actually move the forecast that, say, Shelf Engine was creating up the supply chain to inform these other partners. I think that hasn't been done yet, but I see that in like the next 5 years. And then interestingly,
one of just really quickly, is one of the gaps to that, I could imagine, is actually the data gap you were talking about, where you know the proper monitoring of what is actually wasted. Because I imagine that not having full visibility into that would make the push up to the supply chain even higher, right? Or harder.
That is right. And this was the last solution. You like hit the nail on the head in terms of like what I wanted to talk about here was, you know, there's a company called Lumitics that actually is making AI powered garbage cans with weight sensors and cameras and computer vision that recognizes and tracks the amount of food that you're throwing away. So this could be used in grocery stores. It could also be used in homes or in kitchens or like business kitchens. In restaurants and hotels, so that you start to track that waste and really think about that. And that can help us understand lots of things about what's getting thrown away at different places, what's actually needed at different places, and how to supply those things at those different points in that entire supply chain, which is really fascinating. And as an example of like, did this actually work somewhere? I think like it would be useful to see that it actually works somewhere. So an example of like how this works is IKEA as a success story. I think everybody knows IKEA for the most part. You know, they're like global. They actually took on some interesting initiatives to track the amount of kitchen food waste that they have in their kitchen. So if you go to an IKEA, you can buy food, right? You can buy those really wonderful Swedish meatballs, for example. I know my children love them. Well, tracking all of that, actually, they had to partner with a group. So they partnered with a group called Winnow Vision AI to track kitchen garbage using these same computer vision technologies. And what was interesting was, it turns out they saved 20 million meals, which amounted to 40,000 tons of carbon dioxide. And in terms of dollars, for people who don't speak in carbon dioxide, that's 37 million US dollars that they would have thrown away. So all of that was...
So how did that, I guess I got myself a little confused. So it monitors what's being thrown away. How did they use that technology to prevent throwing things away?
To then collaborate and connect the data points on, hey, you know, how much is actually getting eaten? How much should we actually be cooking? And to kind of bring that...
It was what they did with it, the information.
Exactly. And it took a huge amount of collaboration, which I'm sure was internally driven. I don't know the ins and outs of how it was internally driven, but connecting that data to make it available, to then have it available to these different segments of such a huge company that is operating at such scale, I think had to have been some monumental effort to make these different divisions talk to each other, share that data, share that knowledge, and actually translate that into physical, tangible, reduced waste. And so that, I think, was really impressive. That said, like going back to sort of, do businesses, you know, do they have the ability to do this? I think they do if they collaborate and are incentivized in the right way. I'm pretty sure that one was internally driven. So there is a sort of internal motivation that can help here. But policies can help make this happen. And then technologies can really enable it. You know, IKEA didn't do this on their own. They partnered with this technology that was an AI technology through Winnow Vision. And then they were able to create this larger scale impact that they had, in the same way that we could buy a garbage can also from Lumitics and have them track it in our house and then translate that to save money for our pockets in our future budgets.
Sure. So I guess that, I mean, that's a beautiful summary of the AI kind of solutions in this space. And it is kind of wonderful to hear it kind of articulated that way. It makes me feel inspired by humanity a little bit, but then immediately I'm going to go into, like, I know, like I saw a thing that like the Department of Ag here in the United States had a target of reducing food waste by like 10%, I think, within the next decade, I think is what I read. What's going to get in the way of that? Like, because these are amazing solutions. I also inherently understand that they're not like integrated into our basic operations. But what do you imagine are going to be the biggest hurdles to make use of these pretty wonderful AI solutions?
Two big hurdles, I think. One is, of course, education. Just knowing, like you said, you're inspired for humanity after knowing these solutions exist, right? Once you know they exist, or once you start thinking about it, that education is definitely transformational. That helps people create that adoption, right? So I think that a lot of companies either aren't thinking about it, and a lot of individuals aren't thinking about it or don't realize the impact that they can have. And so I think that's part of it. That education component is a key part of it. There's actually a huge movement in the United States across the governments, different government agencies, that was part of an act that I can't remember during the Trump administration. And that linked a lot of agencies together to say, hey, we need to increase transparency around this, and we need to increase that coordination across agencies so that we move these things forward. So that's been really interesting. There is like an education component, and then a support for localized groups or localized communities and governments to improve waste management, to improve resource allocation, and to build out these educational pathways for people so that they start doing these things a little bit more. Policy changes, I think, would help, but those take a long time to create. And so I think in the shorter term, if we really want to make a dent by 2030, which that is the goal, to make a dent by 2030, it is in part, certainly up to these solutions to market to the right places, to get those things in place. Also responsibility of those groceries and other groups, hotels, et cetera, and even individuals to think about how can we adopt these different technologies, knowing that they are available. So I think the more knowledge that we have about what's possible means that we can hopefully shift the price of those things so that those things come down in price and it becomes more commoditized. So I think that will be an interesting thing that happens over the next decade, is we'll see more of these solutions become more commoditized. And then hopefully we'll also be adopting more of these solutions either at city, state, country levels, at corporation levels, business levels, and hopefully at individual levels. And in an ideal world, we're also seeing some of those changes impacting even things like how we throw food away. So as more places go and create composting, composting actually does make a significant dent as well, which is really interesting. It is efficient to do the local recycling and local composting. It may seem like, oh, doesn't that take extra energy? It does take extra energy, but on balance, that energy actually is lower than the amount of energy it would take otherwise. So those kinds of things all become very important. So similar to how the problem is multifaceted, the solution can also be multifaceted here. And I think we'll see more of that in the next 10 years, hopefully, fingers crossed, because our population's still growing.
Yeah, I know it reminds me of when I was first, when I was first in college, I took this class on environmental sciences, and I still remember the professor, one of his first lectures was kind of asking the class, what's the biggest issue in environmental problems, climate problems, et cetera. And everyone had all these guesses, water, emissions, and, his answer was population. That because all of that just is exponential relative to the population. So makes total sense.
Those are wise words to remember. Yeah.
Yeah. For whatever. Yeah. I'm glad that one stuck.
And we're never going to go back on that trend because most countries' economic model is built on population growth.
Yeah.
So we have to come up with ways to deal with that because it's never going to be reversed.
Right.
Yeah. But we're on good path, guys. So
yeah. It's all very positive. I mean, we over here have the composting, for example. We have our rubbish, our recycling, and our composting, and it's part of our municipal waste here that happens, and that's increasingly common. And all of these things, as we're getting solutions, we can start to actually implement them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I feel like this has been a wonderful summary discussion. I feel like I could talk about it for more hours. But we're probably at our time, I guess. But really appreciate you coming on, Sean, and talking us through this. It's really great to have you on and get you have a great way of sort of summarizing the landscape. That's really been helpful and useful and interesting. So thank you.
Yeah, I hope so. And thank you guys so much for inviting me to give this or to share this. I don't consider myself a global food expert, but it's definitely, like you said, it's a passion, and I think it's fun. And I think it's got a lot of really fun things in AI for us to bring forward as people who work in technology. So I think there's really interesting segments here. So thanks so much for hosting and for letting me share.
Yeah, wonderful. So for any of our listeners who want to look at a previous podcast or newsletters, you can click the link below. And thanks for listening.